A nation's promise, a people's exile. It was a time when America stood at a crossroads between its lofty ideals and its ruthless ambitions. A land that preached liberty and justice, even as it conspired to expel the people who had lived upon it since time immemorial. In the early decades of the 19th century, as settlers surged westward, and cotton wealth transformed the South, Native American tribes were presented with a choice: surrender everything or be erased. They chose to resist, and they paid for it with their lives. This is the story of the Trail of Tears, a forced march that displaced over 100,000 Native Americans and killed thousands. But it is also a story of broken treaties, legal betrayals, and the cold machinery of empire disguised as democracy. This was not a tragedy of chance, it was a crime of policy. The broken treaty seeds of betrayal long before the term Trail of Tears was ever written in a history book. A fragile balance existed between the United States and the native nations of the Southeast. The Cherokee Creek, Choctaw, Chickasaw, and Seminole peoples, known as the Five Civilized Tribes, occupied vast, fertile lands in what is now Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, and Florida. They were not strangers to adaptation. By the early 1800s, many tribes had adopted European-style farming, written languages, and even formal constitutions. The Cherokee printed newspapers and ran schools. They passed laws and held elections. But none of it mattered. White settlers saw only the land. The cotton boom of the 1820s made the southern frontier a gold mine. As soil wore thin in older plantations, the hunger for fresh acres intensified. Georgia, in particular, viewed the Cherokee territory as a rightful prize. State officials dismissed federal treaties that recognized native sovereignty. Squatters poured in. Militia patrols harassed native communities. President James Monroe expressed sympathy but took no action. Meanwhile, a rising political star in Tennessee, a former general known for his brutal campaigns against the Creequists, preparing to seize the reins of the nation. His name was Andrew Jackson, and he believed that the land should belong to white men. The Indian Removal Act. Democracy disguised as law in 1828. Andrew Jackson was elected President of the United States on a wave of populist support, a war hero and a champion of the common man. Jackson's vision of America left little room for compromise with native peoples. For Jackson and his allies, native sovereignty was not a right to be honored, but an obstacle to be removed. Barely a year into his presidency, Jackson championed a new piece of legislation, the Indian Removal Act of 1830. It passed narrowly in Congress by just 5 votes in the House. The act authorized the president to negotiate treaties that would relocate native tribes to lands west of the Mississippi River, ostensibly to protect their way of life. But the language of choice was a thin veil. In reality, it was the beginning of forced expulsion. Many native leaders protested. The Cherokee Nation, in particular, mounted a legal resistance. Their strategy was to fight not with rifles, but with the Constitution. And in 1832, they won. In Worcester v. Georgia, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled that the Cherokee Nation was a sovereign entity. Georgia's laws had no power within Cherokee lands. But President Jackson refused to enforce the ruling. He allegedly quipped, "John Marshall has made his decision. Now let him enforce it." With that, the law became meaningless, and the march toward removal continued. The trail takes shape. Removal begins. The Indian Removal Act opened the floodgates. Between 1831 and 1833, the Choctaw and Creek were the first to be removed. Their stories became previews of the horror to come. Thousands were marched westward under U.S. military escort, enduring freezing weather, starvation, and disease. Many died along the way, their bodies left unburied by the side of the road. The U.S. government called these emigration parties, but for those who lived through them, they were death marches. The Cherokee Nation resisted with every tool available. They sent delegations to Washington. They petitioned Congress. They tried to negotiate for their rights, but internally, they were divided. A small faction led by Major Ridge, John Ridge, and Elias Boudinot believed removal was inevitable. They signed the Treaty of New Echota in 1835, ceding all Cherokee lands east of the Mississippi in exchange for money and land in present-day Oklahoma. The vast majority of Cherokee opposed the treaty. It was never approved by the tribal government. But in 1836, the U.S. Senate ratified it by a single vote. It was a betrayal not just by the government, but by their own people, and it sealed their fate. Roundup. The night the soldiers came in the spring of 1838, the removal order was executed. Federal troops and state militias moved into Cherokee territory under the command of General Winfield Scott. With guns drawn, they swept through towns and villages, forcing families from their homes with little warning. Doors were kicked open, belongings were left behind. Elders and infants were herded like livestock into stockades, makeshift prisons where thousands were crammed together without food, sanitation, or medical care. It was one of the largest forced relocations in American history. The soldiers showed no mercy. Whole families were split apart. Crops were left to rot in the fields. One soldier later wrote that it was the cruelest work I ever knew. By the fall, the army began organizing the journey west. Nearly 16,000 Cherokee would walk over 1,000 miles across mountains, rivers, and plains. Winter was coming, and few were prepared. The long walk, death without burial, the Trail of Tears was not a single route, but a tangled web of paths carved by desperation. The Cherokee were divided into detachments, each led by civilian guides, traveling by foot, wagon, or steamboat. Some routes passed through Tennessee and Kentucky. Others pushed into Missouri and Illinois. They walked through snow, rain, and mud. Many had no shoes. Blankets were threadbare. Food was scarce. Dysentery, pneumonia, and exhaustion claimed lives daily. Mothers buried infants in shallow graves along riverbanks. Elders died sitting in wagons. Those too weak to continue were left behind, or died where they fell. An estimated 4,000 Cherokee perished along the way. But that number cannot capture the full cost. The journey broke more than bodies, it shattered a people's spirit, erased their homes, and tore apart generations of memory and culture. One survivor recalled, "We cried and mourned for those who died, but we had no time to bury them with ceremony. We had to keep walking." The exile, a land not promised, but taken by 1839. Most of the Cherokee had reached Indian Territory, modern-day Oklahoma, but the land was not as promised. There were no homes, no towns, no welcome. The soil was unfamiliar, the climate harsh. Sickness lingered, supplies were meager, and the trauma of the journey cast a long shadow. Worse still, the political divisions that had preceded removal erupted into violence. Major Ridge, John Ridge, and Elias Bodenetha, signers of the Treaty of New Ikoto, were assassinated by fellow Cherokee in an act of retribution. The nation was fractured, but it survived. New towns were founded, schools were rebuilt, the Cherokee Phoenix newspaper resumed publication. The Cherokee Constitution was readopted. In time, the tribe forged a new life from the ashes of exile. But nothing would ever be the same. The Seminole resist. Guerrilla war in the swamp, not all tribes accepted removal. In Florida, the Seminole resisted with a tenacity that shocked U.S. forces. Led by the brilliant and elusive Osceola, they launched a guerrilla war from the Everglades. For 7 years, they ambushed patrols, struck outposts, and melted into the swamps. The Second Seminole War became the longest and costliest conflict between the U.S. and Native peoples. Osceola was eventually captured under a false flag of truce and died in captivity. Thousands of Seminole were removed, but hundreds escaped into the wetlands and remained defiant, free, and undefeated. To this day, their descendants still live in Florida. The national conscience America takes stock. The Trail of Tears sparked outrage among some Americans. Missionaries, senators, and citizens decried the policy as immoral. The poet Ralph Waldo Emerson wrote a scathing letter to President Martin Van Buren, pleading for justice. But their voices were drowned by expansion. The nation was growing westward, hungry for land and wealth. By 1840, most native nations east of the Mississippi had been removed. Indian Territory became a prison of borders until even that would be taken. Still, the memory of the Trail of Tears endured. In time, it became a symbol not just of suffering, but of survival. Legacy and nation remembers. A people endures today. The Trail of Tears is remembered not just as a dark chapter, but as a defining one. It represents the cost of American ambition, the fragility of treaties, and the resilience of a people who refused to vanish. Across the South, historical markers trace the roots of removal. Museums and memorials preserve the names and faces of the lost. Descendants of those who walked still tell their stories. The Cherokee Nation lives on strong, proud, and sovereign. But the scars remain. Never again, on this soil, the Trail of Tears was not a singular moment of cruelty. It was the product of a system built on conquest. A policy of erasure, wrapped in the language of law. And yet, the people it tried to erase are still here. They carry with them the memories of ancestors who walked through snow and sorrow. They remind us that history is not just about what was done but about what must never be done again. Because to forget the Trail of Tears is to forget who we are. And to remember it is to demand that such a march never happens again. Not here, not on this soil.